A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. To Pete, Lindsay, thank you for coming down this evening, and welcome to the Prominent Speaker Series. This evening, our guest speaker will talk on creativity for the next 50 years, and I believe this is and will be an interesting talk to look forward to. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Ms. Lindsay Zoin, without whom I think this talk would not be possible. Round of applause, please. Okay, and allow me to do a very short introduction. Pete Overy. Before he moved from London and Shanghai, before this, and now he's a managing director at IDEO Singapore, responsible for setting the strategic direction of the business in Singapore and Southeast Asia. He's involved in many major innovation projects in the Singapore government, such as the Ministry of Manpower and the Ministry of Health, just to name a few. And last year, he was one of the invited speakers for PS21 Excel Innovation Conference. He shared something about design principles and behavioral sciences on policy design and delivery. So, ladies and gentlemen, Pete Overy.
Hello and good evening. What an amazing venue this is, and to watch this while the sun's going down is quite poignant, I think. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Thank you to the National Library Board for inviting us here this evening. And thank you, everybody, for taking your time this evening to come out and to hear me talk. I'm going to talk for about 25 to 30 minutes, but I want to make sure that I hear from you. So I'm going to take my time, but I want to make sure that we have a good discussion at the end of this. Where were you on the 29th of May this year? March. It's the day of Kuan Yew's funeral. So let's take a moment. I want you to think back to that day. Where were you? What were you doing? Who were you with? Just take a moment. Here's where I was. I was standing outside the Pinnacle at Duxton. I was here in Singapore. I was standing outside in my white shirt and a pair of shorts. I was absolutely freezing cold. It was pouring down with rain, and the wind was stronger than usual. I was surrounded by mostly Singaporeans, young and old. There was a particularly old woman who'd been there since 7 a.m. in the morning, who was wearing one of those auntie shirts. They were very thin, and we were trying to cover her with the umbrella, whilst the water poured down onto my bald head and down into my shirt. We were waiting patiently. We were all absolutely soaked through. We were talking about the events that had happened in the past week and chatting about what it would mean when Kuan Yew came past, and thinking about how we would pay our respects to one of the greatest statesmen in recent memory. While standing in the rain, I asked myself, why is it that I care so much about this man? I've not felt such sorrow and reflection on anyone who's passed beyond my immediate family. And as I reflected on this, I realized that in the last 7 years of living in Singapore, I have in some way been building on his legacy, standing upon the shoulder of giants to continue to help Singapore succeed both in small and big ways. I've been honored, and I'm particularly proud of the work that we've been able to do here in Singapore. It's an opportunity not to be taken lightly. And had I remained in the country where I was born, I don't think I would have had the opportunity to do what we've done here. We've helped ministries, agencies, and organizations in the private sector create positive value and have real impact in improving the everyday lives of Singaporeans. And as a designer, having that level of disproportionate impact is what gets me out of bed every morning. And that's why I cared enough to stand in the rain and reflect, respect, and rejoice at the passing of a man who had laid the foundation of an incredibly resilient nation, one that, although small, I think has potential opportunity to have impact in the everyday lives of its citizens. My name is Pete Overy. I am the Managing Director of IDEO Singapore. I came here full-time in 2010 to open the office here, and I'm very proud to have become a permanent resident in the last few months. And I'm proud to call Singapore my home. But that's enough about me. I want to get back to that incredibly poignant day in March. What the world saw was a witnessing an outpouring of emotion. Singapore was showing the world its bleeding heart. Through the outpouring of grief, it made international news headlines throughout the world. From the initial crowds that gathered on the first day of mourning, young and old alike, paying their respects, from every race and part of Singapore's society. And then we began to witness the true scale. This was the first day of queuing to pay respects to Lee Kuan Yew during his lying in state. This was the view from our office, and you can see the hundreds of people who started to queue in that first lunchtime in the scorching heat. And from the second day, those queues grew and grew and grew, all to pay their respects and remember the great statesman. Until the day of the funeral, this nation grieved. Seeing this grief, this respect, this emotion, the world reframed its understanding of Singapore. They saw this country's people, its values, and its potential in a very different way than it had before. And I want to show you how The Guardian, for those of you who don't know, this is a UK newspaper, they started their coverage of Lee Kuan Yew's passing with one thing that everybody knows about Singapore. It's that they'll flog you if you drop your chewing gum. And that chewing gum is banned. Pretty narrow, right? This was on the day of his passing. 2 days later, Singaporeans have wept on the streets and gathered in their thousands to pay their respects to the country's founding leader, Lee Kuan Yew. 2 days after that, they're starting to ask people in Singapore to send them pictures and thoughts of the mood in Singapore as they began to report on the 10-hour waiting times to queue and pay respects. And then on the day of the funeral, an even greater shift. And I quote, "Undeterred by heavy rain, about 100,000 people lined a 9-mile route through the city-state to catch a glimpse of the funeral cortege." And again in The Guardian, a publication that just 2 weeks before were talking about chewing gum laws in Singapore, they ran a headline that said this: "The UK can learn a lot from Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore." And I quote, "Singapore is increasingly visited by UK politicians seeking inspiration. Could this former colony of the UK prove its salvation?" A marked shift in how they report their view in Singapore, all within 13 days. And finally, articles in the US on a similar theme. The Atlantic posing the question, what is the ultimate purpose of government? From the article, Washington DC is fast becoming an acronym for dysfunctional capital. Singapore, in contrast, has become the poster child for the concept of good governance. These are powerful words from the US. So that was the global media take. But coming back to all of us in this room, on Sunday, the 29th of March, think again, how did you feel? Was there grief? Was there gratitude? Do you feel concerned about what's going to happen next, or are you optimistic? I hope you feel inspired about the future as Singapore reflects on how it got where it is today. I believe you do not need to fear what's next, but you can embrace the future with the same optimism and vigor that the founding fathers instilled in their vision of the first 50 years of modern Singapore, and the collective spirit that has sparked a fresh conversation about what the future looks like. This is compounded by the fact that Singapore celebrates its 50th year. The country is going to look back upon its achievements, and you've certainly achieved a great deal. Value creation and growth, healthcare, education, housing, urban planning, water management are to name but a few. But within each of these, you have achieved great success. You have one of the smallest nations, or one of the smallest nations, but you've created financial independence. You have one of the most successful healthcare systems in the world, in both financing and the results achieved in health outcomes. A merit-based education system, affordable education system that has enabled social mobility for a highly educated workforce. Public housing system and a design that redefines the term, creating affordable housing for a large percentage of the population. Prudent and land use planning and smart land reclamation has enabled social cohesion and strong economic growth. And access to water is universal, affordable, efficient, and of the highest of quality. I say you've designed a pretty great country, and it should be celebrated. This moment of reflection also forces us to look forward and ask ourselves the question, what's next? I had a great discussion with my Singapore colleagues about the future for the country. Their take: we are constantly looking back for best practices, when in reality, we have everything we need to succeed. What we now need is to convey confidently, go about building our future in a confident manner. And there are some great examples, and they cited one, of where Singapore is beginning to export its own best practices. For example, the design and city planning, Andhra Pradesh, new capital in India. What's next? But the confidence and optimism from all parts of Singapore, from government and media outlets around the world, something has definitely shifted. And here's a theory of what happened. We hit oil. Not oil literally, but in the Singapore context, a rich cultural field, one that now untapped has started a journey of discovering a common identity. What was buried is now let out. Let's imagine for a moment if Singapore was to design the grieving process. It would look something like this, with an emotional curve building up and tailing off in a highly orchestrated manner. However, this is what it felt like. It was an emotional roller coaster. How else can we tap into this profound collective spirit and this cultural oil field? I say we're having a moment. A moment to build upon and leap forward from. A moment that brought out the best in Lee Kuan Yew's legacy. His death, it brought out the best in Singapore. Let's stop and think about Lee Kuan Yew for a second. He's the founder-in-chief of modern Singapore. He was also the designer of a nation, and let's talk about those traits. He had an entrepreneurial spirit and was an innovator at a national scale, and here's how he approached challenges. When I set out to do something, I keep on chasing it until it succeeds. A true innovator if ever there was one. He embraced ambiguity and saw the opportunity in the resources at hand. This is one of my favorite, I know because it's quite small, I'll read it out. So you begin your journey not knowing where it will take you. You have plans, you have dreams, but every now and again, you have to take uncharted roads, face impassable mountains, cross treacherous rivers, be blocked by landslides and earthquakes. That's the way my life has been. Many times he trusted his intuition in many of the pursuits and took a very human-centered approach. For example, he fought hard to maintain a balance between efficient urban infrastructure and amplifying Singapore's natural beauty. He was a prototyper, and he wasn't afraid to fail. He said, does it work? If it works, let's try it. If it's fine, let's continue it. If it doesn't work, toss it out and try another one. That's prototyping. And in the last few weeks, I personally have learned more about a man whose mindset and ethos feels very aligned to the designer's mindset we embody at IDEO. He has created a powerful legacy we feel strongly enough at IDEO Singapore to build upon in our mission, which is to help unlock Singapore's creative confidence. Here's our design lens on Singapore's next 50 years. So opportunity number one, designing for people. Which country can bring all the various agencies, ministries, and organizations to come together to create a coordinated, highly networked, positive experience for citizens who came in their thousands to pay their respects? There aren't many. And opportunity number two, let's give Singapore's people a chance to take the stage and design for themselves. Self-initiated provision of food, water, and shelter from the sun that melts the heart and build a rejuvenating bond that surprised some, but I think it's always been there. There was compassion in abundance. The emotional outpouring of thanks and respect brought together various people from organizations large and small to show solidarity with those who queued. And it created a collective cultural spirit not seen at a national level for some time. Some of the highlights for me, things like this beautifully crafted commemorative art and design. So this is Lee Kuan Yew's name written time and time again to create the portrait. It's beautiful. And of course, Alex Yam, Member of Parliament, creator of the tribute ribbon. He writes on his Facebook feed, "It started as a spur-of-the-moment decision. The team worked through the night, a symbol to say thank you. Simple and dignified was our starting premise. From 6 versions down to the final one, we were tired and emotional, but this work doesn't compare to the hard work and dedication of Mr. Lee." And finally, the many stories of people caring for one another in very small ways. So here, Adrian Ang, who had signed up on Facebook as a volunteer, said, "We wanted to collect trash, but halfway through the process, we realized there wasn't any trash at all. And people were hungry, so after queuing so long and needed food. So we took turns to buy food, even getting to McDonald's for children queuing late into the night." What do all of these examples have in common? They're shifting away from the currency that defines Singapore. It's a central tenet of Singapore over the last 50 years, from the 5 Cs. Cash, car, credit card, condominium, country club membership were all symbols of success, the aspirations to obtain material possessions. To a new type of currency in Singapore, one that I believe can define it for its next chapter. And that currency? Creativity. This is not self-serving creativity. It's creativity in service of a dynamic, vibrant, and rich society. Think back to the tributes, including the tribute ribbon that's become part of a national symbol now of thanks. Collaboration. Collaboration that is about coming together to complete common tasks and common goals. Think about the coordination that occurred when the thousands turned up to pay their respects. Contribution. All the members of the public with their small acts of kindness to one another, caring for one another in small ways. Compassion, really having empathy for the needs of all the people paying their respects and putting others first during this time of mourning. And lastly, confidence, the confidence to apply and act upon all of these attributes. So how can this new currency become a natural resource for the future? So remember, we struck oil, we hit oil. Let's answer this by looking at our oil analogy again. Oil for some countries is a resource, and Singapore's resource is its people. Unlike oil, the good news is that people are sustainable and an inexhaustible resource. And if you viewed their creativity as you would any other national asset, you'd harness it, you'd capitalize on it, and you'd measure it. I want you to think for a moment in terms of balancing this. From gross domestic product, with growing creative people. And here are some of the people we've been growing. And across the public and private sector, IDEO Singapore has worked with individuals, organizations, to understand the needs of citizens and consumers, designing new products, new services, environments, positive impact, and value. But here are some of the people we've been growing as individuals. So here's Agnes Quek, a civil servant who took a year-long sabbatical to come to IDEO. She wanted to take on the tools and mindset of designers and to be able to bring these back inside of government to be able to apply them, and now regularly does. To Shafi, a Southwest Community Development Council officer, part of the Social Assistant Network here in Singapore, helping to welcome people into the centres when they need the help the most. Designing new interactions with new spaces that feel less intimidating and more welcoming. And yes, that's me. Incognito, with the first of a frontline staff, learning how to conduct new ways of providing positive financial conversations for patients and caregivers in the hospital system here in Singapore. And we think there are many more. These are just a few examples of the people we think exhibit this new currency. There are individuals, organizations, and businesses embracing this new currency across Singapore. And there are examples of people growing creatively throughout the arts and business community across Singapore. And here are a few examples of me that we've had nothing to do with. But Propaganda, a homegrown company who are one of the quality local ingredients with a most was a powerful grassroots initiative. More of these grassroots initiatives should be encouraged. Han Jin Tan, a Singapore singer, songwriter, composer, and producer, multi-talented, who has worked with some of the biggest stars in the business, from Jackie Chung to Christina Aguilera. Those are inspiring stories, but Singapore needs measurements and value. And so what does that mean when it comes to creativity? So back in about 18 months ago, my creative officer, Chief Creative Officer Paul Bennett, who you may have seen once or twice here in Singapore, did a talk at Skate. And a young lady came up to him after that talk and she said, "Please, sir, can you help me?" She had a question. So her teachers had been telling her that if she was to do science track, she was 79% more likely to get a job. But in art track, I'm only going to get 21% more likely to get a job. So she said, "Can you help me? What should I do?" And he said, "Firstly, I apologize, because this is possibly the only place on the planet, in Singapore, that I would hear that question. Secondly, being a part of the 21%, I feel sorry for you, because I've managed to make a career out of what I've done, and I've been rather successful, and you could too." So then I posed the question for the art track: is that person 21% as likely to change the world? And why would you measure people's careers in this way? So as Singapore loves a measurement, what if we could shift KPI from meaning key performance indicator towards nurturing how we keep people involved? And I hope you're starting to see how much of a natural resource our collective creativity can be. So let's take it back to oil. So if oil is measured in charts that are value of what is bought and sold for, or against how much it is consumed and produced over time, we think that creativity can be measured in how it will feel from start to finish, at what stages it feels ambiguous and that you have to trust in the process, versus more concrete and real parts where it feels like you have information that helps you define the impact that you're creating. We've developed platforms like IDEO, where each participant is assigned a creative quotient which is based upon the ways in which people contribute to that platform. Each contribution gets a point, and the creative quotient is a snapshot of individual strengths, skills, and contribution. It becomes a badge of honor for them. And if you haven't seen this tool, I recommend you go and play with it online and get your own creative quotient. Every contribution you make to the site will give you a measure of what you're doing, and you can measure yourself in terms of ideas, the research that you do, your contribution from your peers, and the impact that your ideas have. So what does this mean for Singapore? So creativity can be measured and value can be placed upon it. And I also believe we can map this to the country's progress as a nation and deliberately amplify design and the creative outcomes, just as Kuan Yew did for Singapore's first 50 years in terms of building the nation. So I'm just going to show you a 2x2, which is very IDEO. And on one measure, you've got vision versus perception, and on the other, you have individual versus collective. And for the first 50 years of this nation, you were building this nation. You had little resources, you need to create economic success and financial independence. Is the next 50 years about nurturing identity and culture, untapping that rich cultural oil field? And so if we're able to nurture from the bottom up, now is the time to tap that rich cultural oil field and nurture from the ground up. I believe this was already in you. So how do we design the conditions for this currency to flourish? You need to embrace creativity as a mindset. You need to recognize it is already in you. All of the examples we talked about earlier were already there. And most importantly, embracing yourself as a creative nation. Too many times I hear we're not creative enough. But can you continue to be bold enough, as the founding fathers did for the last 50 years, to create disruptive change where needed and design your own future? Remember the new KPI, keep people involved. Give them the right permission and develop their confidence to enable new ideas to flourish. You have some great creative role models here, and I have just a few examples. It's from Karen and Sharon Tan of Pocket Projects, who created the projector. And if you haven't been at the Golden Mile Tower, I suggest you go down and support these guys who are doing an amazing job. They've rejuvenated a beautiful old cinema, and they describe themselves as an independent cinema and creative platform that brings together a great selection of films and one-of-a-kind events, versatile spaces, and delectable fare. I recommend a visit. To Jean Liu, a brilliant documentary filmmaker with a huge heart, who strives to take the grittiest stories of the human spirit with relentless optimism and energy. She has recently launched an installation down here, actually. It's part of the National Library project called First Homes. I recommend you go and visit that too. To Nicholas Fu and his team at the Singapore Tourism Board, who are rethinking their approach to tourism impact in Singapore. And they have some amazing new initiatives in the pipeline. We were lucky enough to be introduced to them and their thinking. Watch this space for some great stuff to come. They all embody this new currency for Singapore, the new 5 Cs. And it's no longer interesting, but it's important to unlock this currency. And you need to take it very seriously, because creativity will be the next economic superpower, and we aren't the only ones saying this. In a report from Forrester commissioned by Adobe that highlights how creativity, although an intangible, when fostered within business, it drives success. An example statistic from that report, companies that grew more than 10% and above, of these companies, 58% fostered creativity. The Economist Intelligence Unit and Weber Shandwick's report, released earlier this year called Engaging Cities, which focuses on how soft power as it relates to the reputation of cities, they state that nurturing creativity can establish sustainable growth for a city-state. And being a city-state, highly networked and extremely nimble, this is a great advantage for you. Uncapping the creative potential is one of the keys to success. My question now for individuals, organizations, and the government here, are you nurturing creativity to improve your ability to attract the right creative talent? More and more, what I am hearing is we are brave enough to try new things, try to do new things, and strive to create a society that unlocks its creative confidence. This conversation should grow, and I would like to start tonight. I invite you all to post your thoughts to this hashtag, Singapore's new currency. What examples are you seeing of this new currency here in Singapore? What is inspiring you? What are you doing differently? Let's get the conversation started. I'd love to see this happen over the next 10 years. We already have everything we need to start drawing from our new currency. This is a vision I propose for SG60. I see this new currency, the new 5 Cs, creativity, collaboration, contribution, compassion, confidence, changing hands every single day. And in the last few weeks, we've seen it in abundance. This new currency leads to optimism, resilience, and a vigor that will help unlock this country's creative potential for the next 50 years. Thank you. So I'd like to invite people to ask questions. I think it would be great to hear your stories or your inspirations or things that you've seen that are about unlocking confidence, creative confidence here in Singapore.
My question is, how would a creative person attend school differently? Or what kind of education do you think Singapore should look into to develop more creative talents?
I think firstly, we need to embrace it as a talent that's equal to other talents. I think when you look at the measure of science and art track, and you have teachers asking you whether or not you're 79% versus 21%, that doesn't help. Saying that, in the UK, I had the same problem myself. When I was looking at my A-levels, I was asked to do maths. Was it maths? And one of the sciences, and I asked to do art and design, and they told me, you have 8 GCSEs and art. So that was very off-putting. So I think for those who really want to do it, you still have to struggle through it. But I think it's important for the education system to embrace it as an equal in terms of the opportunity it provides.
Absolutely agree with that. Thank you.
Who's coming?
Hi, my name's Lee Han. I run a small startup here in Singapore. We're in the tech space. And I find when working with our suppliers in Singapore that creativity in the sciences is something that's missing in this country. So I'd like to hear your point of view about how you've seen creativity in that realm grow and what we can do to that effect.
Well, that's a very good question. That's not something I'm particularly knowledgeable to answer. I think in terms of, again, right, in terms of the skill sets that people require in this day and age, there's a lot that we see that is defined in and around certain methodologies for innovating or creating new ideas that is very business focused rather than opportunity focused. One of the things that we try to instill with the methodology that we use is to truly understand the kind of end result of the needs of whoever you're designing for and who you're innovating for. And I think it's important even within the science realm to figure out what those skill sets that are needed to expand the toolkits that people have. Time and again, in my time in Asia, I've seen too many people start with the answer rather than reframe to the appropriate question that they're really trying to create impact for. So I think it's about kind of broadening the current skill sets that people have and how do we train them appropriately with a new set of skill sets. And design thinking is one of those tools and methods to help you broaden your ability to answer today's tough questions. I don't know if that answers your question, because I know very little about the sciences creative world.
Hi, I'm Yingling. I'm a student now, so I'm interested to know your personal creative journey and how you develop your own creative confidence. Thank you.
Wow. I'm old now, I've got no hair. This is going to be a long story. No, I'm joking. So back in the UK, and I started to allude to this earlier, even back in the 90s, and we had a very strong design culture, I think, at that time. It wasn't still regarded as a job in the same way that when I was at school and I was being asked to be groomed to go to top universities like Oxford or Cambridge, to become a lawyer or a doctor or somebody else who gets paid inordinate amounts of money, it was still considered to be not a career that you went down. And so I had to go against the grain. I had to go and find my own path within that and fight my teachers, my parents at that time, and say, this is something I really want to do. And eventually everybody was okay with that. Along the way, I think what you find is that in particular sectors, it's important to still figure out what you want to be doing and the impact you want to have in the world, whether that's in the social space or the business space, or it's even just in a creative space, in a creative environment. And deciding which type of creative environment you want to be a part of is very important for you. I think I've been very lucky. I made a lot of decisions that went my way. It wasn't necessarily thought through or well considered. At one stage, I started my own business, for instance, and it was a brand consultancy in the UK. We were doing very well. We had 15 people. And I decided at a certain point that we weren't being creative enough. We weren't able to hit a certain ceiling, which happens in the brand consultancy world, where you're not big enough to play with the big guns, but you're too small to really get the work that you're trying to strive for. And so I had to create a decision and say to myself, okay, I'm going to give this up. And it's something I'd always wanted to do. And when I look back on it, it was actually quite a courageous one. It didn't feel courageous at the time. I felt like I'd let myself down. But looking back now, as a 40-year-old, it was something that pivoted my life. I ended up freelancing at IDEO and then got a full-time job, moved to Shanghai, and then we won a piece of work that brought us here that then created the office that we have today. So a lot of that was very serendipitous. It wasn't necessarily so thought through. But I think one of the things that I've always instilled is I always wanted to have a certain level of impact in anything I did. I didn't ever want to just put lipstick on a pig. And a lot of times in the world of graphics and brand communications, it feels that way. So I always strive to create other ways to develop strategy or business direction for people. And a lot of the times I did that for free. But what it did do is it taught me a whole bunch of things that allowed me to do the things I'm doing today. So I wouldn't change it for the world.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hi, Pete. Thanks for the talk. I just have a question, because when we talk about building a culture, building this whole culture of creative confidence, sometimes for the man in the street, culture is a very hard word to comprehend. It's almost like, okay, I only care about what happens under my own roof, right?
Yep.
So where is this beginning point, the starting point of, the change of mindset? Because a lot of the older generation actually associate creativity with the arts, very artsy-fartsy kind of thing. It's something they can't really comprehend in terms of what sort of results come from it. So as I say, for young Singaporeans now, people who are going to become parents in the future, do you see that as a starting point in terms of how you kind of shape the creative culture and creative confidence of a new generation of Singaporeans?
That's a very good question, my dear. I think in the same way I was talking about the stuff that I've just seen happen, right? It feels like this cultural essence of creativity has always been there. The idea that you built a nation from pretty much scratch, even for that generation, okay? It's about realizing in terms of the creativeness that they have applied rather than it being arts, and stretching that out in terms of trying to establish a connection or a communication that happens in that point of view. I think going back to your point around whether or not it's this next generation, yes, of course it is. But there's also the need for us to kind of engage the pioneer generation too. And I see grassroots things that are happening. Some of them are government things and some of them are grassroots things, where they're doing those things. They're connecting back to the creative side, whether that's to do with things that they used to do or make or build or create, and they had skills, whether that was carpentry or whatever it might have been. How do we connect back to those things and amplify them and make them valuable again? Not necessarily in terms of monetizing it, but in terms of actually connecting people within the community, or making those connections in terms of skill sharing, or learning from somebody who has a craft. Lots of those things here get kind of forgotten. They're the old guy in the corner who has the really kind of rubbishy looking shop house. But they have a craft and a skill, and they have a whole series of things that if you were able to converse with them for more than 20 minutes, you might find that there's a whole raft of things you could learn. How do we tap that? That's important too. So there's multiple ways I think you need to do it, to answer your question.
So, because I work with kids quite a bit for some of the social advocacy projects, and I find that when I tell them to do certain things, you kind of question your own values or your own definition of creativity as well.
Sure.
It's almost like you're taking into consideration like your whole upbringing here in Singapore and what defines that sort of creativity. So if we funnel it down to actual activities, or ways of going about to build this creative confidence, what is it that the man in the street can do?
I think you do this very well, actually. You do it. You don't just say you're going to do it. You actually action a bunch of stuff and you apply it. Some of it won't work, and that's okay, and some of it does work. And I think you embrace that. I've often seen you embracing that on a very different scale. So I think more people need to do that. There's too much talking of stuff, not enough doing of stuff, right? So I think that's a very important part of it.
Thank you.
So you talked about some of the challenges that we've overcome using very creative ways. So some of the problems were healthcare, education, housing. How do you have any ideas or predictions of challenges that we will face in the future?
Well, that's an interesting question.
I know it's a bit like asking you to predict the future, but in terms of Singapore for the next 50 years, what are the big challenges that you think we might face?
I think you're pretty, one of them is definitely the aging population. How do you start to create value from the connection, the necessity around chronic disease that's going to occur, where these people are housed? Lots of these guys live alone. What does that mean? How do we deal with that? How do we start to establish very different value systems around that? There are interesting things that are happening in Thailand where you've got old people's home with orphanage. So you've got children and old people together and playing with one another. So it starts to create different value sets. What are the ways in which Singapore's going to deal with that? That's very important. There's too much NIMBYism going on at the minute, not enough how do we deal with this? I think the other thing might be land scarcity, right? At a certain point here, the land scarcity is going to create this kind of tension between everything that's being built today and the necessity of a livable city, right? We want green spaces, we want places that we can run and go to the parks. Those parks, at a certain point, people are going to find that there are some trade-offs that are going to have to be made. That's going to be a challenge. In terms of economics, that's also, there is, at some point, if China doesn't do so well, there are also things like that that will have a very fundamental effect to this region. What does that mean for Singapore? How do we deal with that? Because it's an island and you're importing lots of things. So what are the ways in which we can start to be self-sustaining? Are there smart things we can do now? I know the government and other entities are doing lots of investment in things like that. But I see those types of things.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, based on your extensive experiences working with different companies, spanning across a large variety of industries, do you think creativity is something that could be institutionalized? And if yes, what are the different ways that you have seen it being done? And if not, how do you suggest it could be done?
So I think the answer to that is yes. I think we believe everybody has the ability to be creative. However, in terms of the things that need to get done, we use a method called design thinking, and someone recently just said to me, design thinking without design is only thinking. So within that realm, you need designers to help you create the things that you require in the future. So it's incredibly important you grow the right cohort of designers here to establish the innovations that are required for the next 50 years. That being said, we do strongly believe in being able to train people to be much more creative. We have various ways that we develop skill sets in people, transfer knowledge. There are tools that we've been designing over the years. Open IDEO is one of them, where we can install that within organizations. And within that organization, you can start to develop challenges, and people then use the tool, learn what they're good at and what they're not so good at. Then they're able to say, actually, I want training in this piece, or I want to expand my knowledge in these areas. So it's about permission within an organization. It's about creating the right environment, and it's about using the right tools, but it can be taught.
So I have a quick question about hiring. You've talked about the problem of creativity or whatnot in Singapore. How does IDEO go about hiring the people that make that team that expands the creativity in the country? Thank you.
How do we go about hiring? We have an excellent talent director who's very good at finding us the kind of diamonds around the world. No, I think it's important to set out what you need from the role that you're asking someone to fulfill. We have deliberately created what we call T-shapedness to ourselves, which is that we're very strong in a particular craft, but we're also broad enough and curious enough to want to work on things that stretch you as a designer and take you out of your comfort zone. So to do that, you need people who have a curiosity. They may have kind of diverted out of one career path into another. They may have made some mistakes. They may have been, they're kind of oddballs that don't fit a career path and don't generally walk down the same road everybody else does. It's important to recognize that in people and not to judge and think about what that could mean for you as an organization. And I think the other thing about creativity, it's always good to be able to talk to people about how they go about things. What's the work that they've done? Not just show you the work that they've done, but how did they think about it? What are the research things that they did? What are the ways in which they tried and tested certain things? So all of that gives you a much more rounded flavor of the person, rather than just what's said on the CV or done in the interview.
My question is more about, so creativity leads to a lot of unpredictability, from possibility of failure to amazing success. I mean, as compared to like more tried out methods where what you're going to achieve. So when you're talking with whether it's people in the team or external companies, how do you empower them with the confidence to try out creative methods?
Sure. So nobody knows what they're going to achieve, number one. Like, no one has any idea. They think they have the idea. They may have mapped that out on an Excel spreadsheet, but they don't really know. I think one of the things that we strongly believe in is establishing a very deep understanding of the ecosystem and the people you're designing for. Once you do that, you can put in layers of rigor to really understand the nuance of what you're executing and designing for. In that way, you start to see the impact immediately, and you start to trust in what you're doing. So it's a very tangible process. So it helps people shift out of what is effectively an intangible world, an analytical world, into something that becomes much more tangible. When we do that with clients, we talk about the stories of work that we've done before, and we give them examples, right? So the ways in which we can show the path that we've taken others is the way in which we can help another party understand the types of methods that we use and the impact it can have.
So I just wondering, like, are there any other examples out there in the world, you know, some other nation where creativity has been successfully imbibed as a part of the, you know, culture?
So Denmark has a very strong design culture. It's been embedded in the last 60, 70, 80 years. And in terms of the way in which they apply that on just about everything. And the whole of Scandinavia has a similar ethos, actually. But in terms of creativity, I think many governments are suffering from this, and many countries are therefore suffering from it, because the public sector is kind of behind the private sector in its ability to make change. Lots of that's just due to the nature of bureaucracy, right? If I'm going to spend some money, I need to make sure that I'm not going to be corrupt. So most of these governments try to instill that. So it just makes things slower, not unlike, you know, not as quick as private entities do. In terms of other countries where creativity is important, I think the US has made leaps and bounds in terms of where it is today, in terms of what design means from a cultural standpoint. The UK too is doing some things now. The design industry has gone through its ups and downs there, but it's making inroads. But we haven't seen anything that's so prolific yet in terms of a whole nation.
So I have a follow-up question. So you said Denmark, it took around 60, 70, 80 years. So how long do you think it would take, you know, for us in Singapore?
10. I believe that, actually. I think that's the point of there's a lot of untapped ability on this island right now. And most of that's to do with, I think, some of the construct of how you see culturally and also systematically where the arts and design is. It's kind of lower than these other things right now. But that doesn't mean it can't be applied in a different way. And a creative mindset can also be applied in a very business-minded sense too. So whether you work in a bank or in the financial industry, you can still have a creative mindset and apply the different methods to create the impact that you want to achieve. And I think here especially it's about expanding the toolkit right now. The toolkit has been done in a specific way. It's about expanding it in the appropriate way now, and that will start to unlock that further, hence my 10 years. And also, you're very good and very nimble when you put your mind to it. In 50 years, you've created what you have today. That's pretty astonishing, right? So, and it's one of the biggest economic success stories on the planet. And as to the articles I showed, people are now starting to pay attention more because of everything that's just happened. They start to actually quiz about it and go, oh, this is rather interesting. Why has that happened? And so I think in 10 years' time, you have an opportunity to fundamentally shift where you are today.
Thank you.
So I'd like to follow up on what you just said around having conversations. I think so I grew up in Singapore, and I think that as a nation, and I think myself included, that the art of conversation is sort of lost on us as a people. Like, we don't really appreciate how it is to have a good conversation, to know how to tell a good story. I mean, of course, there are exceptions and all that, but I feel like that's a really important part of creativity, that as a nation, I just feel like we're sort of, I don't know, lacking in that. You know, at a dinner party, they're just not as fun, you know? And so I'd like to hear your thought on that, given you've lived in so many different cultures.
Is Singapore not as fun as the UK? It depends. We certainly drink a lot more, so I think that has a large amount to do with it. In terms of the art of storytelling, having been here for now 7 years, 5 years full time, I think there are a lot of things you immediately see as very, very different, right? So as an Angmo, people will go around and start talking about certain aspects of Singapore. Over the 7 years, what I've started to realize is actually, to the point of the storytelling bit, once people get to know you, that fundamentally changes. And the fact that the color of my skin and that I have no hair depending on their age, they look at me like I'm kind of the scary monster in the corner, right? But now what seems to happen, because I have a cohort of people, both local as well as foreign, who know me, it's a very different set of stories that we talk about, or a very different part of the history that they talk about, and it's unlocked in a different way, and it just takes more time. I mean, look at tonight when I first stood up on stage and said, ask any questions, and everyone went, and then 5 minutes later, there's lots of questions. I think it's just that you take longer. It's not that you don't do it at all.
So this was a follow-up question. So I think maybe what I mean is something different. So an example would be, one could say, oh, I was crossing a bridge and I was hit by a car. Or you could say, it was a dark and stormy night. And, I was thinking about da-da-da, and before I know it, I stepped ahead. And you know what I mean? Like, there's a dramatic way to live one's life and to have a different experience of life. And I think that there are particular nuances in the way we live in Singapore that are eliminated by our efficiency, perhaps.
That's
or something
fair.
like that.
That's fair enough. I think there's a certain aspect of living on a 27-kilometer square island, right? There is a big world out there. If you were in the US, for instance, you might say to yourself, I'm going to take myself to California. That's halfway across the planet, right? If you say, I'm going to live in Woodlands, it's a 2-hour walk, right? So it's a very different mentality around sense of scale, sense of place, and I think that has a lot to do with that. So I think one of the interesting things for me is that currently my niece is going through this right now. My wife's brother's daughter is being asked at 10 to construct composition. Now I said at 10, why would she know how to do that? Her world is like describing in the same way you just did. So they're kind of forcing a composition upon her at 10 years of age, and I don't think she fully understands the construct. Instead of embracing it or making it exciting or making it interesting, it's being kind of forced in. So maybe that has something to do with the output then for people when they're talking over time. Because if you make it interesting and you make it inspiring, it changes the way in which you would naturally talk about stuff or build stories. I think that's very important. So a lot of this will have to be to do with certain education elements and how it's taught to people. It's also to do with the fact that the inspiration is only finite in this, in a certain set of land. So making sure you're inspired by the way in which you travel or get out and see other cultures is very important too.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Zoe.
Hello.
My question is, you created a new set of 5 C's that Singaporeans can work towards and tap on. But do you think another C, complacency, will come in the way, especially since we're so comfortable right now as compared to 50 years ago?
That's a very good question. No, I don't think so. I don't think, well, this is the interesting thing about the complacency. In the work that we do here, in the companies that we do it with, and the private sector and the public sector, I don't see complacency in those organizations. They're striving to look for the next thing. This is such a tiny market, right? So if you're in a private sector, you have to be thinking about what's next, because it's a necessity, right? In the public sector, they're constantly driving towards new ways of doing things, new ways of either saving certain aspects of money, building positive impact for citizens. So I don't see that complacency in the work that we do. I know that it gets talked about in the press. I often think this comes back to the question you just raised, which is, I think you're all too hard on your bloody selves. Stop it. Like, I think there's some English trait that you happen to have taken on, which is a bit like, oh, no, we don't. Don't do that. I showed that thing earlier. You've designed an amazing country, celebrate it, support it, embrace it. The cultural aspects are already there, the identity is already there, just lift it and bring it out. At the minute, you're kind of waiting, and I don't know why. It's like...
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chin. I belong to the pioneer generation.
Hello.
And I'm totally guilty of the old 5 C's. The students that are in school today, they go home to their parents, who I'm sure will tell them, you be a doctor, you be a lawyer, you be a banker, and nobody's telling their kids, you go apply for a job at IDEO. So, do you find a place for you to go to schools directly to influence the kids and give your viewpoint.
No, but we should do more of that. That's a very interesting. So I think right now, in the context of kind of what jobs are there in the future, I think Singapore's guilty of deciding what those jobs will be for those kids. We have no idea in the next 20 years what the world is going to look like. I was talking to some teachers recently about this, and they're saying there are new things we're going to do. We're going to help people decide what job they want to do in the future when they're young. And I'm like, how do you know what job they're going to do? That's ridiculous. Like, we didn't know there were going to be technical engineers and software engineers in the way that we have them today. 20 years ago, we didn't have any idea what was happening in terms of the certain aspects of new things that are going to happen. How do you start to design for that? So how do you embrace the fact that certain things are going to merge in the future? Or how do you embrace the fact that even work culture in the future might mean that you don't have a job, you do more like freelance aspects, or you move around in different forms? We don't know what that means yet. So how do you start to embrace that and design that into the system now so that people have a much broader sense of the skill sets that they need? We already know that the skill sets of today aren't prolific enough in terms of the tool sets that people need to design and innovate for the future. How do you do that into the education system now? There are new things we need to do. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
I'm Patrick here. Thanks for the talk. I like to differ from their opinion that precisely why I brought my 10-year-old daughter here is because to be inspired by Pete. Well, jokes aside, a question that I have is that obviously with innovation and creativity, there's always the risk side of things. So the risk appetite is something that, I mean, the way we are brought up, obviously we are afraid of failure. We are always thinking of how to succeed. So the risk appetite for failure is obviously not quite large as per what we want in terms of being able to experience things and innovate things in that regard. How do you see Singapore basically transform itself in this manner? Especially how does the organization at large or public sector at large do that better than today?
So I think it's two things. One is the way in which I was just talking about the traits of the founding fathers. I mean, these guys did have any idea what the future held, right? But they were deciding on particular vision and moving towards it. That's embracing failure on every level, right? I think what's important is measuring things in the right way. Creativity and the outcomes of creativity can be measured. The rigor that you currently put in today and the very analytical stuff that you do here in Singapore, there are other ways to establish a certain set of boundaries that allow you to move forward. I think, so number two, I think that the more people have the broader set of skill sets, the more knowledge they have in terms of the opportunities rather than the problems that they face, that's going to be very important. Often in the work that we do, we try to help people reframe their problem into a potential solution or opportunity for the future. That helps you unlock a different way of thinking about it. You're not constrained by all of the things you currently have today. You're suddenly looking at the potential of the future. That's a very important mindset shift to embrace. And it's also a set of skills that you need to start to embrace and embody too. So I know that in different areas of both the public and the private sector, these things are being embraced here. They're being embraced not too much, but in the way that I kind of designed how you would design the grieving curve, you're almost designing certain aspects of how you would design. And so you need to let some things be free versus constrained. That's very important too. But we see organizations changing here. We see their senior leadership thinking about what the possibilities of the future are and wanting to reframe and wanting a different approach. What you did before, the A plus B plus C plus D, now no longer equals E. Right? It's A times B times C, and it's completely all over the place, right? So all of the current tool sets you had before can't help you predict the success you need in the future. So you need different tools. And those tools are the ability to reframe and the ability to look for those opportunities.
Hi, my name is Wensi. I'm just wondering that when you work with either government agencies or the private sector, and you want to try something new, but they already have something in place, and do you ever have this experience that they want to try something new, yet they don't want to let go of the old one? So you might just end up with something that is a very uncomfortable hybrid. And if so, how do you persuade them to maybe you could let the old go?
Wow, that's a hard question to answer. where have we done that before? So I think part of the keeping hold of the old is because if it depends. Are you in the public sector or the private sector, by the way? Huh? Okay. So in the public sector especially, things can't switch off, right? It has to continue. So the machine is running, so it has a thing that exists. So to expand that or do something new is quite problematic, especially whether that's a service or a particular part of the ecosystem you're providing. I think it's important to recognize that there are certain ways to establish different outcomes. So you can keep the old, but you might try experiments that are small in the new. So what we try and do is we create the prototypes in the way that I was talking about earlier that establish evidence for you to be able to shift people over. So that evidence helps you to understand what's working and what's not, what aspects is being developed that are positive outputs that you need to improve on the existing system. So you may have measures that you wanted to create in the first instance. You look for those measures of success, and if they're there, you can start to scale the new thing. So I think it's not about whether it's old or new. It's about whether or not you can start to establish a new understanding of a potential future, small, and then start to expand that and create more evidence and more evidence and more evidence.
Can you tell us a bit about your favorite project that you've worked on at IDEO, or like one that you think is the most creative?
Cool. Whoa. What's the most creative? I'll tell you what the most fun I had. The picture of me in the background there, the purple one. So me in the, basically it's the staff from the frontline staff from the hospital. The reason it was most fun is because we were taking an incredibly, it's broken, right? The healthcare system is intentionally broken. It's broken, unfortunately. It's hard to do stuff within it because everybody's so busy, right? They need to deal with things that are about dealing with death or dealing with illness. So when you walk into a hospital and everyone's incredibly busy and you're a consultant going, hi, let's do this. Everybody's like, we're a bit busy. So one of the things that this was most fun is because I took a bunch of people who were incredibly busy. We helped them design their own job and helped them then expand into the prototype that we designed, and they kind of got there themselves. So by doing that, they're incredibly empowered because they designed their own job. They got to the space we wanted them to, so I had to trust in my own process of prototyping that they would eventually get to a place that I wanted them to, because we had an idea situation of things that we tested with patients and we thought this was most appropriate. But to get them there, it would have been too big a leap. So we trained them over a period of months. We went back in, I observed them doing these kind of consultations, and they effectively moved themselves. So in terms of the fun that I had with a bunch of guys on the front line, who are amazing, on a daily basis they deal with all sorts of problem people, you know, angry people, people wanting less bill, all of this, et cetera, et cetera. It was a lot of fun to help them fundamentally change their role within the hospital and give them a much better kind of job satisfaction. So that it's not necessarily the most creative, but it was the most powerful in terms of their transformation and their role transformation.
Singapore has excelled educationally. I think we see that in international PISA studies. Economists talks about how they do so well academically, education-wise. Yet there's no Mark Zuckerberg ever from this system. There's no Steve Jobs. There was the one guy who created Creative MP3 that's gone the way of Yahoo, I think. So we have this crux, I think. The other thing is that we want to sell Singapore as a hub. We want to be the next Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is all about creativity and seeing what the next Facebook, the next LinkedIn is. So what happens is we attract that foreign talent that comes here looking for that. So what happens to the Singaporeans who graduate from this great educational system? I have friends from Switzerland. They are actually they're skin specialists. That's all it is. Yeah, but they're not practitioners. They are in the business of research of dermatology, and they're all out at Buena Vista, and they're from Switzerland. They're not from here, and they're trying to get Singaporeans, doctors, dermatologists who've excelled, who've got all the first generation of 5 Cs to get into research, to go for the next thing. So you were asking about where does science come in with creativity. That's an example, and I think Star Vista is an example of that, and the other one, Biopolis and things like that. So my question is, like, we've got this great education system, these really bright people academically scoring world, globally, really right on top, science, math, reading, everything, yet there's no Steve Jobs. Is that sort of like, does that contradict, does that inhibit that type of creativity? At the same time, we're attracting foreign talent here. So what happens to those amazing Singaporeans that come from that system? That's my question.
I think Steve Jobs is also a byproduct of not just Silicon Valley, right? He happens to be a person that went through the system in the US, happened to be of a certain time where computers were at the brink of where they are today. Sure, but I think it's difficult to say in terms of, the ecosystem needs to have the right levels of the ability for the talent that you want to attract to do the work that they want to do, but it also has to be able to grow the existing talent in the system. I think part of the struggle at the minute is the education system is good. It's just that, is it doing all of the things it should do? I'm not sure it is. I don't know. I'm not an expert on it myself. But I know from the conversations that we have here with local Singaporeans, people will ask questions of the way in which they were taught things or how they were kind of embraced into that. And so what sort of encouragement is there? What are the way, the science art track thing that we saw earlier? If I want to do humanities and science, I have to fight tooth and nail, apparently, according to the friends I have here. Why? Why can't I do that if I want to? What is it that's stopping me? Well, who decides in the system that I have to go down one path or another? If I go to a very high-educated school and I'm very bright, and then I drop out and become a musician, everybody frowns at me. Why? Right? So this is about the ecosystem having a balance across all of these things, and at the minute, it's not quite there yet, right? But I think that's you have that problem the world over. It's not just a Singapore issue, right? But at the same time, the education system can be improved, should be improved, continue to be evolved. In terms of the question around the jobs for locals and the kind of foreign talent, I mean, that's a difficult one again, right? It means that potentially the system isn't growing the talent that is required today. So that goes back to the question that we had earlier, which is, are we nurturing the people in the right job track? Does that job really exist or not? Are they in a more narrow field rather than a broader field that we need people to be? Potentially. I don't have the answer to that. It's more of a hypothesis of what I hear from friends and colleagues and things. In terms of the system here, because it's so small, the ecosystem, it's only 5.5 million people, right? It's actually very hard to sustain the kind of Silicon Valley model in this environment. It's actually too small. So what's the Singapore version of that? That's the question I would ask. So it has to be different. It can't be Silicon Valley. So what is it going to be? So I'd rather see it being evolved into a new way, Singapore's version of that, not America's version of it. And that goes across all of the different aspects of both science and et cetera, et cetera.
Hi, I have a question for everyone in the audience. I want to know how many of you have heard of World Toilet Organization, if you could raise your hand. Okay. So about 4 years ago, or maybe 5 years ago, I worked with Jack Sim at World Toilet Organization, who's known globally. And lots of students were active in helping us create these world toilet seats that were designed by local students who then helped put them out to be auctioned out so that we could raise money for raising the awareness of the problems with sanitation globally. And this man is a Singaporean. So I just think that design, creativity, everything comes from you seeing the opportunities, and the C that I can't stress enough in this country is collaboration and compassion. Those two are really your issues. And that comes from you seeing that you have creativity in you. You are part of the solving. Each one of us right here has that opportunity within us. So I would say, if you don't know of Jackson, I would love you to look it up, World Toilet Organization, and there's lots of opportunities like that. I'm currently involved with a startup that's working on hiring issues in Thailand, and we are in the JFDI Accelerator. And the reason I asked the question about hiring is I see that issue is, like, I really want to understand why people don't feel like they can ask for what they want to be. Rather, they feel like they have to fit that box. And I feel like that's what I really love about IDEO, is it doesn't ask, oh, do you want to be a marketer? What are you interested in? And I just wanted to ask something from the audience, because I think if we're all here to do something, then we have to start now. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anna. Something you mentioned before briefly, but it didn't appear in one of your C's, was curiosity. So this is something that I have a discussion with a lot with people. When I went to uni, it was like kind of what you mentioned, you know, do law, medicine, something, they're quite technical. So these are the types of areas that you don't actually apply that much curiosity, whereas other things like science or arts, where you do research, you learn how to be curious and ask questions, and that helps you in the workforce. So if you were to apply design thinking to creating the future of education, because it is quite a global issue, I don't think it's just in Singapore, what would be some of the things that you would try and establish in the first phase, for example?
Wow. I think, again, right, this is to do with, there are multiple parts to the ecosystem of education, right? So you have your peer networks, you have the teachers, you have your parents. All of those things need to be fully considered in terms of the paths that people take. There are lots of influences on your life as you go down paths. Just because you become a lawyer doesn't mean you're not curious. I have lawyer friends who are incredibly creative, but most of them don't see themselves as creative. But I also have another friend who works at Optus, right? And he sells multi-million-dollar deals and is highly creative. He could read you immediately, talk to you about your life, and sell you ice, even if sell you ridiculous things at a ridiculous price. Highly creative individual who laterally thinks in the moment. Often these things are missed because they don't behave in a normal creative manner. So I disagree that curiosity doesn't exist in certain forms. I think it's more to do with the way in which you're, the educational element of what you're reading and how you're taught it versus your innate ability. So I think in terms of the first step that needs to happen is some of the ways in which you learn certain subjects. What are the other things that are influences on law that are parts of the potential way in which you could unlock different levels of curiosity in people? Why do they have to be so narrow when they're going in certain paths? So one of the things I potentially might do is to figure out where we could learn from other parts of the education ecosystem, how you could input that into particular areas where we feel like there's not enough curiosity right now. I think it's one of those things that I've heard before when I first moved here that Singaporeans weren't curious, right? And after 2 or 3 years, I would stand on a little stage like this and bang my drum and say, I think that's ridiculous. I think it's more to do with the fact that the ecosystem of how certain organizations work means that people kind of just do their thing because they're told what to do. And it doesn't allow them to be curious, and therefore they just switch off. And then when someone actually asks them, they switch back on. But you have to give them permission you have to give people permission. It's not just Singaporeans, I think. This is the same in the UK. When people are battered down in a cubicle in an environment and they just do the same thing day in and day out, you just ask them to be curious, they're not going to be. So how do you engage them on a broader term, help them understand the outcomes of what they're about to do, help them get excited about the outcomes, show them the outcomes and the impact? They'll do it time and time again. So I think it's important to recognize that it's not just a kind of single, narrow focus.
Hi, hi Pete. That was a great sharing. I'm Jian Liang, and I guess Amy knows me as Ian. Yeah, I'm really all for working towards SG60, and the slides were awesome.
Thank you.
Most important question of the night: where can I find the slides that you have shared?
That I don't know. You'd have to come and talk to me afterwards.
Thanks.
I hope this is the last question. Okay, now you talk about everything. What you think 10 years, your opinion, maybe education, what you expect Singapore to be in sense of education, maybe skill, coding, programming, CAD system to be learned, or maybe in economic sense, what you expect Singapore to be, maybe as some database center or anything. What you think? I mean, at the end of the day, you have to have an objective. No point like me, I want to say SG60, but personally, what do you think Singapore SG60 should be?
So I'll tell you what I'd love to see. Being such a highly networked island, you all know one another. All of the organizations are very interconnected in terms of who they know in different positions, in different organizations, both public and private. You need to use that more. The fact that the telcos and the banks and the ICA and all these other things, technically, if you started to connect certain pieces of that together, it would make a fundamental difference to the experiences you could design, the impacts of livability on this island. Things would be fundamentally different. And you have the ability to do it. You couldn't do that in England. It would take you too long. But because these things are all technically highly networked, how do you start to break down the silos of the organizational silos between different businesses and organizations and collaborate in a different form? That's what I'd love to see in the next decade. It would change the livability of the city fundamentally for the better.
Good evening, Pete. Chun Lian from DSTA.
Hello.
Yeah, I hope mine is the last question. So I'm just curious, would you be able to distill a formula for creative confidence?
Distill a formula. There is no formula, but we define it as the natural human ability to come up with breakthrough ideas and the courage then to act on them. That's creative confidence. So it's not a formula, it's a statement of intent.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to thank Pete
Thank
and
you, guys.
Lindsay, of course. And for the rest of you for being such a very great audience. Something for you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much to spend your time here this evening. I think you missed your dinner. So, hope to see you again on our next Prominent Speaker series. Yeah, it will be notified in our portal. Thank you so much and have a very good evening.